The morning of her wedding day had dawned bright and beautiful, but inside the bridal suite, the air felt thick and stifling. Claire stood in front of the full-length mirror, barely recognizing herself beneath layers of lace, makeup, and expectations. The room was crowded with her mother and bridesmaids, all busy perfecting her image for the biggest day of her life. The bouquet was waiting on the vanity, a symbol of the happiness she was supposed to embrace. But instead of excitement, a growing wave of anxiety began to settle into her chest, tightening like an invisible noose. Her mother's voice pierced through her thoughts, instructing one of the bridesmaids on how to adjust the veil. Claire looked at herself in the mirror, her gaze meeting the hollow-eyed reflection. She saw someone beautiful, but that beauty seemed trapped caged by the carefully constructed image of a perfect bride. The walls of the bridal suite felt like they were closing in, the noise of chatter and laughter like a distant hum, blending into an unending wave of expectations pressing against her from all sides. The door clicked closed as her bridesmaids finally left, giving her a moment to herself. Claire turned her head towards the window, watching the breeze sway the curtains, hinting at freedom just outside. A fleeting thought turned into a sudden, urgent impulse. Her heart pounded, her fingers grew numb. It was now or never. She grabbed her purse with trembling hands, her heels dangling from her fingertips, and she moved swiftly to the side door. She opened it, her breath caught in her throat, and without allowing herself to think, she slipped outside. The air hit her face like a slap, fresh and cool, and she let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. With her bare feet brushing against the cold ground, Claire moved through the manicured garden, her heart thundering as she evaded sight. The faint music from the reception carried through the breeze, the laughter, and the joy of people she was supposed to entertain, to be perfect for. Each step felt like a small rebellion, a tiny slice of freedom from the life that had been set out for her. She reached the edge of the venue property, the tall hedges acting as a boundary between her and everything she had once thought she wanted. Claire's eyes darted around until she saw it a taxi, parked nearby. She approached the car, feeling the earth beneath her feet, the dress heavy on her legs, her hands gripping the small purse with her essentials. She tapped on the taxi's window, startling the driver, and as he rolled it down, she leaned in. "Take me anywhere but here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but enough for the urgency to reach the driver. He looked at her, puzzled for a second, but then nodded and gestured for her to get in. She slid into the back seat, her wedding dress pulling around her, the veil discarded beside her. Claire looked out the window as the car pulled away, watching as the venue disappeared behind her, the life she had almost accepted growing smaller and smaller until it was just a memory fading into the landscape. The countryside rolled by, green fields blurring into the distance. The driver glanced at her in the rearview mirror, clearly concerned. "Are you all right, miss?" he asked gently. Claire forced a smile, a nod, though the pounding of her heart spoke of anything but calm. She was scared of what she'd done, scared of what might come next, and most of all, scared of the emptiness she now faced. But beyond the fear, there was a hint of something else, possibility. The taxi pulled into a small town about an hour away, and through the window, Claire saw a quaint little CAF with an inviting glow. She didn't know where else to go, and she needed a place to gather her thoughts. "Here," she said to the driver, pointing to the CAF. He nodded, pulling over. Claire stepped out of the taxi, her feet touching the cobblestone of the small square. She looked at the cozy storefront with its wooden sign and mismatched tables visible through the window. She took a deep breath and walked in, her wedding dress causing heads to turn, but she didn't care anymore. She approached the counter, ordered a coffee, and took a seat by the window. She sat there, staring out at the street, her hands trembling slightly around the warm cup. Everything felt surreal, like she was in a dream she couldn't wake up from. The CAF's quiet buzz enveloped her, contrasting with the chaos in her mind. And then she noticed him, a man sitting a few tables away, watching her. Not with judgment or curiosity, but with a gentle kindness that seemed out of place in her whirlwind of emotions. He smiled a simple, warm smile. He stood up and walked over, his steps cautious as if he didn't want to scare her off. "Mind if I sit here?" he asked, his voice soft, carrying an air of understanding. Claire looked up at him, her eyes meeting his. She saw someone who didn't expect anything from her, someone who wasn't there to tell her what to do or who to be. Slowly, she nodded. The man sat down, setting his coffee on the table. "I'm Brian," he said. He didn't ask why she was in a wedding dress, didn't pry into her story, just offered his name like a bridge across her confusion. "Claire," she replied, her voice shaky, her fingers still gripping the cup. They sat there in silence for a moment, the weight of her escape still heavy on her shoulders, but somehow his presence seemed to ease the tension, even just a little. Brian sipped his coffee, his demeanor relaxed, as if they were just two people casually meeting at a CAF. After a few moments, he looked at her, his eyes kind but not pitying. "You look like someone who could use a little space," he said quietly, his words more of an observation than a question. Claire felt a tear welling up, and she blinked it away, nodding. Brian smiled again, a small curve of his lips. "You know," he began, "I'm kind of traveling myself, just seeing where the road takes me. No real destination. If you want, I could use some company, at least for a little while." No pressure. Claire looked at him, her breath hitching at the thought. A stranger, offering her a way out, a chance to escape everything without needing to explain herself. She hesitated, fear still creeping her, but something about his calmness made her consider it. What if she just let go, even for a day? She nodded slowly. "Maybe just for a little while," she whispered. Ryan's smile widened slightly, and he stood up, extending his hand to her. "Then let's go," he said, his tone light, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. Claire took his hand, feeling its warmth, its solidity. She stood, her wedding dress brushing the floor, her heart racing. Together, they stepped out of the CAF into the late afternoon sunlight. Ryan led her to his car, an old sedan, its paint chipped but its spirit resilient. He opened the door for her, and Claire slipped inside, her heart pounding with fear, uncertainty, but also something new, hope. As they drove away, Claire watched the town disappear in the rearview mirror, her heart slowly lifting, the weight of expectations slipping away with every mile. The open road lay ahead, winding and full of unknowns, but for the first time, Claire felt like she was heading towards something she chose. And that, she realized, was all she had ever wanted. The engine hummed softly as they left the small town behind, the road stretching endlessly ahead of them. Claire sat in the passenger seat, her gaze shifting from the passing fields to the beaten-up map that lay crumpled in her lap. She ran her fingers across the paper, tracing routes without any real direction in mind. The uncertainty of the situation both terrified and excited her. For the first time in years, she didn't know what was going to happen next, and that was strangely liberating. Ryan drove with a calm ease, glancing over at Claire every now and then, allowing the silence to settle comfortably between them. He reached over to the car's radio, fiddling with the dial until soft music filled the space, giving an unexpected warmth to the cold air of uncertainty that hung over them. Claire let herself relax a little, the anxiety loosening its grip as she leaned back against the seat, letting the music's rhythm soothe her. "Do you have a destination in mind?" Ryan asked, breaking the silence gently. His eyes were still on the road, his hands steady on the wheel. Claire looked at the map again, her lips curving slightly at the irony of the question. She shook her head. "No, I don't think I want one," she said. "I've always had a plan, a destination, somewhere to be." But now, she trailed off, the weight of her words hanging between them. Ryan nodded as if he understood completely. He turned off the highway onto a smaller road, one lined with rows of tall trees that seemed to stretch toward the sky, their branches forming a canopy overhead. "No destination it is," he said lightly. "But there's a lookout point not too far from here. It might be worth seeing, if you're up for it." Claire hesitated, then nodded. She was still figuring out whether or not she could trust Ryan, but something in his demeanor made her want to try. He had been nothing but kind since they met, and his calm, unassuming presence felt like a balm to her frazzled nerves. She watched as they drove, the sky starting to change color, the soft pinks and golds of the late afternoon painting the horizon. When they reached the lookout, Ryan pulled the car to a stop on a patch of gravel. The sun was beginning to set, casting brilliant hues across the sky. Claire stepped out of the car, her bare feet touching the cool earth, and walked toward the edge, where the hills rolled out into the distance, bathed in the warm glow of the sunset. She took a deep breath, closing her eyes as the breeze blew past, rustling her dress. The sense of freedom she felt was almost overwhelming. It was as if all the weight she had carried with her, the expectations, the disappointments, the fear, was slowly starting to lift. She opened her eyes to see Ryan standing beside her, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice almost lost in the wind. He looked over at her, one eyebrow raised. "For not asking too many questions," she added. Ryan smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "I figure we all have things we're running from. Sometimes talking helps, but sometimes it just doesn't." He turned back to the sunset. "I'm not here to push you into anything, Claire. We'll take this one moment at a time." Claire felt her throat tighten, an unexpected lump forming as emotions threatened to spill over. She had felt so unheard for so long, like her voice had been swallowed up by everyone else's wants and needs. But here, with Ryan, it was different. She was allowed to exist without explanations or expectations. She found herself opening up without meaning to. "I ran away today," she said quietly, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "From my wedding, from everything I thought I wanted." She let the words hang there, raw and unvarnished, waiting for judgment. But there was none. Ryan nodded slowly, as if considering her words carefully. "I can see why that would be hard," he said after a pause. He looked at her, his eyes filled with understanding, not pity. Sometimes the hardest thing is choosing yourself over what everyone else wants for you. The sincerity in his voice made Claire's heart ache. She didn't know why she was here, with this stranger who seemed to understand her better than the people she had known her whole life. But she was, and for now, it felt like exactly where she needed to be. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in fiery colors, Ryan opened the trunk of his car and pulled out a tent. He looked at Claire with a questioning smile. "What do you say we camp out here for the night?" "It's not much, but it's got a view." Claire smiled, the tension easing from her shoulders. Sure, she said, surprising herself. She had always been the kind of person who needed a plan, but here she was, agreeing to camp under the stars with someone she had just met. They worked together in the fading light, setting up the tent, gathering wood for a small fire. The air grew cooler, and Claire wrapped her arms around herself, feeling the chill as night began to fall. Ryan lit the fire, the flickering flames casting shadows across the landscape, bringing a sense of warmth and security to the darkening world around them. They sat by the fire, sharing stories as the stars appeared above them. Ryan spoke of his travels, of how he was looking for something he hadn't quite figured out yet, his voice carrying a note of longing that Claire recognized all too well. She found herself laughing at his tales of mishaps and small triumphs, her guard slowly falling away, piece by piece. Ryan listened as she talked about her own life, her words hesitant at first, but gaining strength with every sentence. She spoke of the wedding of Derek, of the life she had almost walked into, a life that wasn't hers. Ryan listened without interrupting, his expression one of quiet attentiveness. It felt good to speak, to let it all out, and for the first time in a long time, Claire didn't feel judged. As the fire crackled and the night deepened, Claire looked up at the stars, the vastness of the sky reminding her of just how small her worries seemed against the backdrop of the universe. She turned her gaze to Ryan, who was staring into the fire, his expression thoughtful. "Why are you traveling?" she asked, her voice soft, not wanting to break the calmness of the moment. Ryan looked up, his blue eyes meeting hers. He hesitated, then smiled, a sad, wistful smile. "Because I needed to get away," he said simply. "Sometimes staying in one place just makes it harder to move on from things." Claire nodded, understanding more than she cared to admit. She didn't press for more details, and he didn't offer them. They sat there in silence for a while, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the gentle rustle of the wind through the trees. Eventually, Ryan yawned and stretched, his eyes twinkling in the firelight. "We should get some sleep. Long day tomorrow full of more, not knowing where we're going," he said with a grin. Claire laughed, nodding. They climbed into the tent, the air inside warm and comforting despite the coolness of the night outside. Claire lay down, staring at the ceiling of the tent, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. She didn't know where she was headed, what was waiting for her, or if this was even the right choice. But for the first time, she was okay with that. As she closed her eyes, she heard Ryan's quiet breathing beside her, a steady, calming presence in the chaos of her mind. And slowly, Claire let herself drift to sleep, her thoughts of Derek, of her abandoned wedding, and of all the expectations she had fled from fading into the quiet night, replaced by the simple hope of a new beginning. Claire awoke to the sound of birds singing and the soft rustle of leaves as a breeze swept through the campsite. She blinked, the morning light filtering through the fabric of the tent, bathing everything in a gentle golden glow. For a moment, she forgot where she was. The unfamiliar surroundings the tent, the soft murmuring of nature made her heart skip a beat. Then, the memories of yesterday came flooding back, the runaway bride, the CAF, and Ryan. She turned her head and saw him through the open flap, crouched near the campfire, focused on making coffee. Claire slowly pushed herself up, stepping out of the tent, the morning air cool against her skin. Ryan looked up and smiled, his blue eyes warm in the early light. "Morning," he said, his voice low but cheerful. He gestured to the steaming coffee pot. "Hope you like it strong." "I'm afraid it's all I have." Claire smiled back, her anxiety from yesterday momentarily forgotten. "Strong is good," she replied, stretching her arms as she moved closer to the fire. She took a seat on a makeshift log bench, and Ryan handed her a cup. The first sip was hot, but comforting, and Claire wrapped her fingers around the cup, savoring its warmth. She gazed at the still lake nearby, the water reflecting the morning sky, perfectly calm. For the first time in what felt like forever, Claire wasn't in a rush. There were no bridesmaids, no makeup artists, no one telling her what needed to be done or how to feel. It was just her, Ryan, and the promise of a day without expectations. Ryan seemed to sense her thoughts. "It's peaceful here, isn't it?" he said, his voice almost wistful. He looked at her, a small smile playing on his lips. "You don't strike me as someone who's had much peace lately." Claire let out a soft laugh. "You could say that," she admitted. She traced the rim of her cup with her finger, her gaze still on the lake. "Everything was just, so planned, every part of my life. And I went along with it because that's what I thought I was supposed to do." "But it didn't feel right," Ryan nodded, his expression understanding. He didn't rush her, didn't fill the silence with meaningless words. Instead, he simply listened, and that was enough to make Claire continue. "Yesterday, when I ran," she said, her voice quiet, "I think it was the first time I actually did something for myself." She looked at Ryan, meeting his eyes. "I'm not sure what comes next, and it's terrifying, but at least it feels real." "You know," Ryan's smile widened, and he nodded. "I get it," he said, his eyes sincere. "Sometimes you just need to take that leap, even if you have no idea where you'll land." They finished their coffee in comfortable silence, the sun slowly climbing higher in the sky. After packing up the tent and putting out the fire, they set off again, Ryan driving while Claire looked out at the landscape that unfolded around them. The road wound through hills and forests, every turn revealing something new, something untouched by her past life. They drove until they reached a small town, one that seemed almost timeless, with cobblestone streets and old buildings that spoke of simpler times. Ryan parked the car near a bustling square, where street vendors and musicians filled the air with life and laughter. Claire stepped out, her eyes wide as she took in the scene before her. She had never experienced anything like this, not in the controlled environment she had lived in, with her structured plans and carefully maintained facade. Ryan gestured toward the shops that lined the square, his grin infectious. "What do you say we explore a bit? Maybe get something to eat," he suggested. Claire smiled, the tension that had sat in her chest for so long finally loosening. "Yeah," she said, feeling a flicker of excitement. "Let's do it." They wandered through the square, Claire marveling at the vibrant colors of the stalls, the laughter of children as they chased each other, the smell of freshly baked bread wafting through the air. It all felt so alive, so different from the stuffy receptions and formal dinners she had grown accustomed to. They stopped at a small bakery, the owner a kind-looking older woman offering them freshly baked pastries. Claire bit into one, the sweetness melting on her tongue, and she laughed, a sound that felt unfamiliar to her ears. Ryan looked at her, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he smiled. "You seem different today," he said as they continued walking. "Lighter." Claire looked at him, her smile softening. "I feel different," she said honestly. "I feel free." She paused, then added, "I think I forgot what it felt like to just enjoy something without worrying about what it means or what comes next." Ryan nodded, and they walked together, their hands brushing occasionally as they moved through the bustling streets. At one point, a musician began to play a lively tune, and Ryan turned to her, his eyes bright with mischief. "Care to dance?" he asked, extending his hand. Claire hesitated for a split second, then took his hand, letting him lead her into an impromptu dance in the middle of the square. The music swirled around them, and Claire laughed as Ryan spun her, her dress flowing, her hair catching the light. She wasn't thinking about tomorrow, or Derek, or the expectations that had weighed her down. She was just here with Ryan, in this moment that felt like it was just for them. Afterward, they found a bench and sat down, the energy of the square still buzzing around them. Claire leaned back, her eyes closing as she let the warmth of the sun wash over her. It felt surreal, this happiness, like a dream she didn't want to wake up from. The sound of her phone ringing shattered the tranquility, and Claire's eyes flew open, her heart sinking as she pulled her phone out of her purse. Derek. His name flashed across the screen, a reminder of the life she had run from, a life she wasn't ready to face. She hesitated, then answered, her voice shaking. "Hello, Claire." Derek's voice was filled with confusion and a hint of anger. "Where are you? What's going on?" Claire's throat tightened, and she glanced at Ryan, who watched her, his expression concerned but supportive. She turned away slightly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just needed some time, Derek. I needed to figure things out." Derek's voice grew sharper. "Figure things out?" "Claire, you left me at the altar. Do you have any idea what you've done?" The weight of his words pressed down on her, guilt mixing with the determination she still held onto. She took a deep breath, her hand shaking. "I know, Derek. I'm sorry. But I can't do this right now. I need space." There was a long pause on the other end, and Claire closed her eyes, bracing herself for his response. Finally, Derek spoke, his voice quieter. "I just don't understand. But, fine. Take your time. Just let me know when you're ready to talk." The line went dead, and Claire let out a shaky breath, her hands trembling as she lowered the phone. She felt Ryan's presence beside her, his silence comforting in a way she hadn't expected. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "I'm not ready to go back," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "Not yet," Ryan nodded, his eyes gentle. "Then we won't," he said simply. "We'll keep moving until you're ready." Claire looked at him, gratitude welling up inside her. She had spent so long being told what she needed to do, what was right, what was expected. And here was someone who was giving her the freedom to just be, without asking for anything in return. They stood, Ryan taking her hand as they made their way back to the car. Claire looked out at the square one last time, the laughter, the music, the life that filled it. She knew she wasn't running away anymore, she was running towards something. Something new, something she couldn't yet define, but something she wanted with all her heart. As they got back into the car and Ryan started the engine, Claire glanced at him, a small smile playing on her lips. "Let's keep going," she said, her voice filled with a newfound resolve. Ryan smiled back, his eyes meeting hers. "Anywhere in particular?" he asked. Claire shook her head, her smile widening. "No, just somewhere new." And with that, they drove off, the road stretching ahead of them, endless and full of promise. The coastal air was cool and salty as Claire and Ryan drove into a small seaside town, the sun hanging low over the horizon, bathing everything in a soft, golden light. The sight of the ocean took Claire's breath away, the endless blue, the rhythmic crashing of the waves, the salty breeze that seemed to promise a fresh start. Ryan parked near the edge of town, close enough to hear the distant roar of the ocean, and they stepped out of the car, stretching their legs after hours of driving. Claire gazed around, something tugging at her memory as if she had seen this place before. The town felt oddly familiar, but she couldn't quite place why. There was a sense of déjà vu that she couldn't shake, of a nagging feeling that left her slightly on edge. Ryan seemed different too, quieter than usual, his eyes shifting around as if searching for something he couldn't quite name. "Do you want to walk along the beach?" Ryan asked, breaking the silence. His voice was softer, almost hesitant, and Claire noticed the tightness in his smile. She nodded, brushing away the strange feeling gnawing at her. They walked side by side, the sand shifting beneath their feet, the sky turning from gold to a deepening purple as the sun dipped below the horizon. For a while, they strolled in silence, the sound of the waves crashing against the shore filling the space between them. Claire could sense something was bothering Ryan, something he wasn't saying. She glanced at him, watching as his eyes remained fixed on the ocean, his expression pensive. "Are you okay?" she asked finally, her voice gentle. Ryan looked at her, his eyes dark and filled with something she couldn't quite read. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah," he said, though Claire knew it wasn't entirely true. "It's just being here. It brings back some memories, that's all." Claire frowned, her curiosity piqued. She didn't push him though, sensing that whatever it was, he would tell her in his own time. They continued walking until they reached a rocky outcrop, the moonlight casting a soft glow over the waves crashing against the rocks. Ryan stopped, turning to face her, his expression now serious. "Claire, there's something I need to tell you," he began, his voice low, barely audible over the ocean's roar. Claire's heart skipped a beat. She could feel the tension emanating from him, the weight of whatever he was about to say. She took a step closer, her gaze locked on his, her breath catching in her throat. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Ryan hesitated, his eyes searching hers, as if he was trying to decide whether to continue or not. Finally, he took a deep breath, his shoulders sagging as he spoke. "There's a reason why I knew your name before you told me, why I felt like I knew you when I first saw you in that CAF." Claire's brow furrowed, confusion washing over her. "What do you mean?" she asked. Ryan ran a hand through his hair, his eyes filled with regret. "I knew Derek, your fiancé," he said, the words hanging heavily in the air between them. "We were connected. It's complicated, but let's just say that something happened between us, something that hurt both of us deeply." Claire felt her stomach drop, her chest tightening. The world seemed to shift beneath her feet, her mind struggling to process his words. "You knew Derek," she repeated, her voice trembling. "Why didn't you tell me before?" Ryan's gaze dropped to the sand, his shoulders slumping. "I wanted to," he said. "But when I met you, it didn't feel like the right time. And then, as we spent more time together, I didn't want to risk losing this." "Losing you?" Claire stared at him, her heart pounding in her chest. Everything she thought she knew seemed to unravel in that moment. She took a step back, shaking her head, trying to make sense of it all. "So, what was this then?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Was it just some twisted coincidence, or was this planned?" Ryan looked up, his eyes filled with pain. "No, Claire," he said, his voice urgent. "This wasn't planned. I didn't even know you were Derek's fiancé until that day at the CAF. I swear to you, meeting you was a coincidence. And after that, I stayed because I wanted to be here, with you." But Claire couldn't hear his reassurances. The shock and betrayal overwhelmed her, the reality of Ryan's connection to Derek crashing over her like a wave. She turned away from him, wrapping her arms around herself as she tried to process everything. Claire, Ryan said, taking a step towards her, his voice breaking. Please, just listen. She shook her head, tears blurring her vision. I trusted you, she whispered, and now I don't know what to believe. Ryan reached out, but she took another step back, her heart aching. She needed space, needed to think, needed to be alone. Without another word, she turned and walked away, her feet carrying her down the beach, the sand shifting beneath her as if the ground was crumbling under her. She heard Ryan call her name, his voice filled with desperation, but she kept moving, her tears flowing freely now. The cool night air struck her skin, the wind carrying away the sounds of the ocean. She walked until her legs ached, her mind spinning with confusion, her heart aching with a mix of betrayal and loss. Finally, she found herself at the edge of a small cliff overlooking the sea. She sank to her knees, her body shaking with silent sobs. The weight of everything she had run from, everything she thought she had escaped, seemed to press down on her now, heavier than ever. She had trusted Ryan, had begun to believe in the possibility of something real, something honest. And now it felt like that trust had been shattered. She didn't know what to do, where to go, or who to turn to. For the first time, she felt truly, completely alone. The sky was dark, the stars scattered across the vastness above her, indifferent to her pain. She watched the waves crash against the rocks below, the rhythmic roar drowning out her thoughts. She closed her eyes, the tears slipping down her cheeks, her heart aching with every beat. Hours seemed to pass as she sat there, the chill of the night settling into her bones. Eventually, she heard footsteps approaching, and she looked up, her heart sinking as she saw Ryan standing a few feet away. His eyes were filled with regret, his expression pained. I know you don't want to see me right now, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But I can't leave without saying this. Claire, I never meant to hurt you. Meeting you was the best thing that happened to me, and I swear, everything I've felt, everything I've said, it's all real. I care about you more than I've cared about anyone in a long time. Claire looked away, her heart torn. She wanted to believe him, wanted to hold on to the connection they had shared. But the fear of being hurt again held her back, the fear of making another mistake, of trusting the wrong person once more. I need time, she said finally, her voice breaking. I need to figure this out on my own, Ryan nodded, his face etched with pain. I understand, he said. He hesitated, then added, I'll be waiting, Claire. Wherever you decide to go, I'll be here. With that, he turned and walked away, his figure disappearing into the darkness. Claire watched him go, her heart aching with every step he took. She knew she wasn't ready to forgive, not yet. But somewhere deep inside, a small part of her still held onto the hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to each other. As the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon, Claire rose to her feet, her body weary but her spirit not yet broken. She knew she had a long journey ahead, a journey to find herself, to heal, to understand what she truly wanted. And maybe, just maybe, that journey would bring her back to Ryan. But for now, she needed to take that step alone. The sun was barely up when Claire awoke to the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks below. Her body was stiff from spending the night outside, but she welcomed the cold air that brought her a sense of clarity. She had spent the night wrestling with her thoughts, torn between the desire to protect herself from further pain and the hope of something real with Ryan. Now, as the first light of dawn painted the sky in shades of pink and orange, she knew she had to make a decision. Claire slowly stood up, brushing the sand of her clothes, her gaze turning towards the distant silhouette of Ryan's car. He was there just like he had promised. She took a deep breath, the salty air filling her lungs, and started walking towards him. Each step felt heavy with uncertainty, but with each stride, she also felt a growing resolve. Ryan was leaning against his car, his eyes fixed on the horizon, his expression somber. When he saw Claire approaching, he straightened, his gaze locking onto hers. The tension between them was palpable, the unspoken words hanging in the air, demanding to be heard. "Morning," he said, his voice gentle, almost tentative. He searched her face, trying to read her thoughts, his own expression filled with uncertainty. Claire stopped a few feet away, her heart pounding in her chest. She met his eyes, her own filled with a mix of emotions, fear, hope, and something else she wasn't quite ready to name. "I've thought about everything," she began, her voice steady but soft. "And I need to know the truth, all of it." Ryan nodded, his eyes filled with regret but also determination. "You deserve that," he said. He opened the car door and gestured towards the passenger seat. "I'll tell you everything, but maybe we should find a quieter place." Claire hesitated for a moment, then nodded and got into the car. She still felt the weight of betrayal, but there was also a part of her that wanted to understand. She wanted to hear his side, to know if what they had shared was genuine or if it had all been tainted from the start. Ryan drove in silence, the road winding away from the coast, the scenery changing from ocean views to quiet fields and forests. After a while, he pulled over to a small, deserted lookout point, the kind of place where they wouldn't be interrupted. He turned off the engine, the silence between them almost deafening. Ryan took a deep breath, turning towards her, his eyes meeting hers. "Claire, I want you to know that none of this was meant to happen like this. Meeting you was a coincidence, but it was the best thing that's happened to me in a long time," he began, his voice raw with emotion. "I knew Derek, your fiancé. We had a complicated past. There was someone I cared about, and Derek was part of what happened to them. It's why I left everything behind, why I decided to travel. I was trying to find a way to let go of the anger, the pain." Claire listened, her heart aching as she heard the vulnerability in his words. She could hear the truth in his voice, the regret that weighed heavily on him. She didn't interrupt, letting him continue. "When I saw you in that CAF, I recognized you from pictures Derek used to have. I didn't know what to do, so I didn't say anything at first. And then, when we started talking, I didn't want you to see me as part of the life you were running from," Ryan said, his eyes filled with pain. "I wanted you to know me as I am now, not as someone from your past." Claire's eyes filled with tears, the mix of emotions almost overwhelming. She looked away, her gaze fixed on the horizon. She didn't know what to say. Part of her still felt betrayed, but another part understood why he hadn't told her. After a long silence, she finally spoke, her voice shaking. "Ryan, you should have told me," she said, her eyes meeting his again. "I understand why you didn't, but it still hurts. I thought we were starting something real, and now I don't know what to believe." Ryan reached out, his hand hovering over hers before he hesitated, pulling it back. "I know I messed up," he said, his voice breaking. "And I don't expect you to forgive me, not right away. But Claire, what I feel for you is real. I haven't felt this way about anyone since I lost them. I don't want to lose you too." Claire closed her eyes, the tears slipping down her cheeks. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust him again. She took a deep breath, wiping her tears away. "I need time, Ryan," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I need time to figure this out, to decide if I can trust you again. Ryan nodded, his expression pained but understanding. I'll give you all the time you need, he said. I just hope that one day you'll find it in your heart to give us another chance. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of everything between them heavy but not unbearable. For the first time since she had found out the truth, Claire felt a flicker of hope. Maybe there was a chance for them. Maybe, if they were honest with each other, if they faced their pasts together, they could find a way forward. Eventually, Ryan turned the key in the ignition, the engine rumbling to life. There's a place I want to take you, he said, his voice gentle. It's from my past, and I think it might help you understand more about me. You don't have to come if you don't want to, but I think it could be a step towards rebuilding trust. Claire looked at him, her eyes searching his. She saw the sincerity there, the genuine desire to make things right. Slowly, she nodded. Okay, she said. Let's go. Ryan smiled, a small, hopeful smile, and pulled away from the lookout point, the car moving steadily down the winding road. They drove in silence, but it wasn't the same tense silence that had filled the car earlier. It was softer now, filled with unspoken words and the promise of something more, something real. They reached a small town as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the landscape. Ryan parked the car near a modest memorial, a simple stone marker surrounded by flowers. He got out, his expression solemn, and Claire followed, her heart heavy with anticipation. This is where it all happened, Ryan said, his voice barely above a whisper. He pointed to the memorial, his eyes filled with sorrow. This is for the person I lost, the person I loved. It's taken me a long time to come back here, but I wanted you to see it. To know that I'm not running anymore. Claire felt a lump form in her throat as she looked at the memorial. She could see the pain in Ryan's eyes, the grief he had carried with him for so long. Slowly, she reached out, taking his hand in hers. He looked at her, his eyes widening in surprise, and she gave him a small, sad smile. I think we both have a lot to let go of, she said, her voice trembling. But maybe we can do it together. Ryan's eyes filled with tears, and he squeezed her hand, his smile filled with gratitude. I'd like that, he said softly. They stood there for a long time, side by side, the sun dipping lower in the sky. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but Claire knew that this was the first real step towards healing, towards something new, something worth fighting for. As they walked back to the car, Claire felt a sense of peace settle over her. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she was okay with that. She looked at Ryan, his eyes filled with hope, and she knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. With the past behind them and the open road ahead, Claire felt ready to embrace whatever lay in store. A new beginning, a chance to rebuild from the ruins of what they had both lost. And maybe, just maybe, they could find happiness along the way. Stifling ADJ, oppressively close or restricting. Explanation refers to an environment or situation that feels confining or suffocating. Example, the atmosphere in the bridal suite was stifling, filled with expectations and pressure. Manicured ADJ, neatly or precisely maintained. Explanation, often used to describe well-kept gardens or areas. Example, Claire walked through the manicured garden, her heart racing. Rebellion, noun, an act of resisting authority, control, or convention. Explanation, a deliberate action taken against established norms or expectations. Example, every step Claire took felt like a small rebellion against her PI planned life. Anomaly noun something that deviates from what is standard, normal, or expected. Explanation refers to something unusual or out of place. Example: seeing a taxi parked by the hedge was an anomaly in the otherwise pristine wedding setting. Piqued verb aroused or provoked interest or curiosity. Explanation: to stimulate someone's interest or curiosity. Example: Ryan's calm demeanor piqued Claire's curiosity, making her trust him a little. Wistful ADJ, full of yearning or desire tinged with melancholy. Explanation: reflecting a feeling of longing or nostalgia. Example: Ryan spoke with a wistful tone, reminiscing about the freedom of the open road. Facade noun, an outward appearance that conceals a less pleasant reality. Explanation: the superficial aspect of something that hides the real emotions or situation. Example: Claire's life had always been about maintaining a facade of perfection. Infectious ADJ, likely to spread or influence others in an enthusiastic way. Explanation: used to describe enthusiasm or feelings that easily spread to others. Example: Ryan's grin was infectious, making Claire feel lighter despite her worries. Tentative ADJ, not certain or fixed, hesitant. Explanation: showing caution or uncertainty. Example: their first embrace was tentative, filled with both hope and doubt. Did you enjoy Claire's story in the Runaway Spark? Was the English level easy to understand? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Did you feel connected to Claire's journey and the choices she made? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget, there's so much more to explore here on the channel. To keep practicing and improving your English, check out another story. It'll appear right at the end of this video. I'm sure you'll enjoy it and learn even more. Thank you so much for being here, and I can't wait to see you again in the next story. Stay curious and keep learning.